Chapter 6. An Appointment by the Lake. After dinner that evening, Laura and I went for a walk down to the lake. The atmosphere was gloomy and depressing, but at least we were alone. "I want to have no secrets from you, Marion," Laura said, "but I'm sure you have already guessed what my married life is like. Sir Percival said such cruel things to me in Italy that I turned for comfort to my memories of those happy days with Walter Hartwright. And I have to tell you, Marion, Sir Percival now knows that Walter is the man I loved." I stared at her, and what little hope I had left began to die. "It was at a party in Rome. Some people from London said I should have drawing lessons and recommended a Mr. Hartwright. I could not control myself when I heard his name, and my husband noticed. 'So it was him, was it?' he said, with a horrible smile. 'Well, we will see about Mr. Hartwright. You will be sorry, and so will he, to the end of your lives. And Marion, he uses this knowledge like a whip to punish me, day in, day out.' 'Oh, Laura,' I said, putting my arms around her. This was my fault. Yes, my fault. I remembered the white despair of Walter's face as I told him to leave, as I tore these two young hearts apart. And I had done this for Sir Percival Glyde. For Sir Percival Glyde. It was growing dark when we set out for home, and as we left, Laura seized my arm. "Marion, look!" By the lake was a dark figure, half hidden by the evening mist rising off the water. We began to walk quickly. "I'm sure it's following us," whispered Laura. "Is it a man or a woman?" She was shaking with fear. "It's hard to tell in this light," I said, then called out, "Who's there?" There was no answer. We hurried back through the wood, and when we reached home, I sent Laura upstairs and went to find out where everyone was. The Count and his wife, the servants, the housekeeper, all were inside. The figure by the lake was no one from the house. So who could it have been? The next day, Laura discovered she had lost her bracelet and thought she must have dropped it near the lake. She went off to look for it, while I waited for the messenger from Mr. Kirrell. 1 o'clock came. By now, I was so suspicious of everyone in the house that I decided to slip out and meet the messenger myself. Taking great care not to be seen, I went down to the main gate and a little way along the road. Soon, a cab appeared. I stopped it and said, "Are you going to Blackwater Park?" A man put his head out and said, "Yes, with a letter for Miss Halcombe." "You may give the letter to me," I said. "I am Miss Halcombe." I read the letter quickly. "Dear Miss Halcombe, your letter has caused me great anxiety. It seems very likely that Lady Glyde's signature is needed so that a loan of all or part of her £20,000 can be made to Sir Percival. This is almost certainly illegal, and Lady Glyde should not sign any document until I have examined it first. Sincerely, William Kirrell." I read this very thankfully, and told the messenger to say that I understood the letter. As I spoke these words, Count Fosco came round the corner and suddenly appeared in front of me. Completely taken by surprise, I stared at him speechlessly. The messenger drove away in his cab, and the Count took my arm to walk home with me. He talked pleasantly of this and that, and asked no questions about letters or messengers, so I assumed he had found out everything. He must have read my letter, returned it to the postbag, and now knew that I had received an answer. There was no point in trying to deceive him, so I said nothing, and just tried to seem quite cool and calm. Back at the house, we found that Sir Percival had returned, in an even worse mood than before, it seemed. When I told him Laura was out looking for her bracelet, he growled, "Bracelet or no bracelet, I shall expect to see her in the library in half an hour." I turned to go into the house, but behind me heard the Count saying to Sir Percival, "May I have 5 minutes' talk with you, here on the grass?" They walked off together, and I went inside to the sitting room to think over all that had happened. Before long, however, the door opened softly, and the Count looked in. "Good news, Miss Halcombe," he said. "The business of the signature is put off for the moment. I'm sure you are relieved." He went out before I had recovered from my amazement. There could be no doubt that this change was due to his influence. His discovery of my writing to London and receiving an answer had caused him to interfere. Now there was even more to think about, but, exhausted by worry and the heat of the day, my eyes closed and I fell into a little sleep. I woke to find Laura's hand on my shoulder. "Marion, the figure at the lake. I've just spoken to her. It's Anne Catherick. Look, she found my bracelet." Still half asleep, I stared at her stupidly. "Anne Catherick?" "Yes. I was searching in the boathouse," Laura went on, "when a woman in a white dress came in and said quietly, 'Miss Fairley, I have your bracelet. Your mother would not want you to lose it.' I jumped up, but her voice was so kind that I wasn't afraid. I asked her how she knew my mother. She said her name was Anne Catherick, and asked me if I remembered, as a little girl, walking with her and my mother to the school in Limmeridge one day. I did remember. Suddenly, I saw that we were like each other, but her face was pale and thin and tired. It was how my face might look after a long illness. 'Why do you call me Miss Fairley?' I asked, and she answered, 'Because I love the name of Fairley and hate the name of Glyde.'" "Did she say anything about your husband?" I asked. "She said that after she wrote the letter, she did not have the courage to stay in Limmeridge to try to prevent my marriage to him. She was afraid he would find her and shut her up in the asylum again. But she was not afraid any more, because she was so ill she thought she was dying. Then, Marion, she said that she and her mother knew a secret that my husband was afraid of." "Yes, go on," I said eagerly. "What secret?" "She was just going to tell me when she thought she heard a noise outside. 'We are not alone,' she said. 'Someone is watching. Come here tomorrow at this time, and I will tell you.' Then she pushed me to one side and disappeared." "Oh, Laura, Laura, another chance lost. But you must keep the appointment tomorrow. It seems so important. I will follow you at a safe distance. She must not escape this time." We were silent for a time. Then Laura said anxiously, "Why hasn't Sir Percival called us to the library to sign the document?" "Oh, yes, I forgot to tell you," I said. "Thanks to Count Fosco, the business of the signature has been postponed." "But why?" Laura said, amazed. "If Sir Percival urgently needs money, how can it be postponed?" I heard Sir Percival's lawyer mention a second plan, to give a document promising payment in 3 months. "Oh, Marion," she said, "that would be such a relief." "Yes, it would. Let's hope that it's true." That evening, Sir Percival was polite, even pleasant, especially to Laura. This must have been due to the Count's influence, and it worried me. What lay behind it? I was sure that Sir Percival's sudden journey yesterday had been to Welmingham to question Mrs. Catherick. What had he learned? What were his plans? As the evening passed, I grew more and more uneasy, and I went to bed feeling very anxious about what the next day would bring. I was not wrong to be anxious. The next day, Laura and I arranged that after lunch she would go alone to the boathouse, and that I would follow a little later, taking great care that Anne Catherick did not see me, in case she was frightened by the appearance of another stranger. Sir Percival had gone out earlier in the morning, and did not appear even for lunch, so it was quite easy to put our plan into action. However, when I came quietly up to the back of the boathouse, I heard no voices, no sounds of movement, nothing. Soon I was searching inside the boathouse and softly calling Laura's name. But no one answered, and no one appeared. Outside, I searched the ground for signs, and found the footprints of 2 people in the sand. Big footprints like a man's, and small footprints, which I was sure were Laura's. There was also a little hole in the sand by the wall of the boathouse. Desperate with worry, I hurried back to the house. The first person I met was Mrs. Mitchelson, the housekeeper. "Do you know," I asked, "whether Lady Glyde has come in?"
"Yes, she has, Miss Halcombe, and I am afraid something unfortunate has happened. Lady Glyde ran upstairs in tears, and Sir Percival has told me to dismiss her servant, Fanny."
My heart sank. Fanny was Laura's personal servant from Limmeridge, and the only person in the house we both trusted. I ran upstairs to Laura's room. Her door was shut, and there was one of Sir Percival's house servants standing in front of it. "Move away," I said. "Don't you see that I want to go in?"
"But you mustn't go in," she answered. "I have my orders."
Wild with anger, I turned and went downstairs to find Sir Percival. He was in the library with the Count and Countess. "Am I to understand that your wife's room is a prison?" I asked, staring him full in the face. "Yes, that is what you are to understand," he answered. "Take care how you treat your wife," I shouted furiously. "There are laws to protect women, and I will use those laws." Instead of answering me, he turned to the Count. The Count looked at me with his calm, cold grey eyes, but it was the Countess who spoke. Thank you for your hospitality, Sir Percival, she said suddenly. But I cannot remain in a house where ladies are treated as your wife and Miss Halcombe have been treated today. Sir Percival stared at her in shocked silence, knowing, as I did, she would not have said this without the Count's permission. "I agree with my wife," the Count said quietly. Sir Percival swore, then whispered angrily, "All right, have your own way." With these words, he left the room. "We have made the worst-tempered man in England see reason," said the Count. "Thanks to your courage, Miss Halcombe, this insulting situation is now ended." I tried to speak normally, but could not. The Count left the library, then returned a few minutes later to say that Lady Glyde had the freedom of her own house again. Immediately, I rushed upstairs to Laura's room. She was alone inside, and I was in such a hurry that I did not close the door properly behind me. "Marian," she said thankfully, "how did you get here?" "It was the Count's influence, of course," I said. "That horrible man!" she cried. "He's a miserable spy." Just then, we heard a knock on the door. It was the Countess, bringing me a handkerchief I had dropped. Her face was white, and I saw in her eyes that she had been listening at the door. "Oh, Laura," I said when she had gone, "you shouldn't have called the Count a spy. We shall both regret it." "But he is a spy, Marian. There was someone watching me at the lake yesterday, and it was him. He told Sir Percival, who watched and waited all morning for me and Anne Catherick, but she didn't come. I found a note from her hidden in a hole in the sand. She said she'd been followed yesterday by a fat old man. He hadn't caught her, but she was afraid to come back this afternoon. She hid this note very early in the morning and said she would see me again soon to tell me Sir Percival's secret." "What happened to the note?" I said. "Have you got it?" "No. While I was reading it, Sir Percival appeared. He took it from me and demanded to hear everything Anne Catherick had said. He held my arm so tightly. Look, see how he's bruised it. What could I do, Marian? I was helpless. I told him everything." I looked at the bruises on Laura's arm and felt such furious hatred for Sir Percival that I dared not speak. "But he didn't believe me," Laura went on. "He said he knew she had told me more, and that he would lock me up until I had confessed the truth. Then he took me back to the house, gave orders for Fanny to leave, and locked me in my room. Oh, Marian, he was like a madman. What are we to do?" "He is mad. Mad with fear. He thinks you know his secret," I said. "I must act now to protect you. Who knows how long I will be allowed to stay here?" I thought hard for a few minutes. "I will write 2 letters and give them to Fanny to take with her. I can't trust the post-bag here any more. One for Mr. Kirrell, telling him of your bruises and Sir Percival's violent behaviour." "And who is the other letter for?" asked Laura anxiously. "For Mr. Fairley," I said. "Your lazy, selfish uncle. I'll make him invite you for a visit to Limmeridge, without your husband." I left her then, and went to my room to write the letters. Fanny had already gone, and was staying the night in the little hotel in the village, before beginning the long journey to Cumberland the next day. I decided I had time before dinner to walk to the village and back, so I slipped quietly out of the house and set off. From time to time, I looked behind me. Was I being followed, or was my imagination playing tricks on me? By now, I was suspicious of everything, every tiny sound, every shadow on the road, every breath of wind. Earlier, while writing the letters, I thought I had heard the rustle of a silk dress outside my door. I had even wondered if someone had been in my room, looking through the things in my desk. I hurried on, trying to put these thoughts out of my mind. When I got to the little hotel, I saw Fanny in her room. She was very upset at leaving Laura, and started crying, but stopped when I told her that Lady Glyde and I needed her help. "Here are 2 letters," I said. "Post the one addressed to Mr. Kyrle in London tomorrow, and deliver the other to Mr. Fairley yourself when you get home to Limmeridge. Keep them safe." Fanny put the letters down the front of her dress. "They'll stay there, miss," she said, "till I've done what you tell me." Chapter 7. A Conversation in the Night. I arrived back at the house with only 20 minutes to get ready for dinner, and to slip into Laura's room to say that the letters were safely in Fanny's hands. Laura looked pale. "I'm not coming down to dinner," she said. "Sir Percival came to my door, shouting at me to tell him where Anne Catherick is." "At least that means he hasn't found her yet," I said. At dinner, the Count looked hot and red in the face, and his clothes were a little untidy. Had he been out too, I wondered? He seemed troubled by some secret annoyance or anxiety, and was almost as silent as Sir Percival. At the end of the meal, when Madame Fosco and I left the table, the Count stood up too. "Where are you going, Fosco?" Sir Percival said. "Sit down and have another glass of wine. I want a quiet talk with you." "Not now, Percival. Later," he answered. Earlier in the day, I had heard Sir Percival make the same request, and this was the second time the Count had postponed the talk. Why, I wondered, and what was it that Sir Percival wanted to discuss so urgently? We went into the living room, and Madame Fosco, usually so slow and deliberate in her movements, drank her tea at great speed and then slipped quietly out of the room. I began to leave too, but the Count stopped me, first by a request for more tea, then by asking my opinion on some music, and then by playing several noisy Italian songs on the piano. Eventually I escaped from him and went up to Laura's room. Had she seen or heard anything of Madame Fosco, I asked. No, she had not. We talked together till 10 o'clock, and then I went downstairs again to say good night. Sir Percival, the Count, and his wife were sitting together in the living room. I noticed that Madame Fosco's face was now hot and red. Where had she been, and what had she been doing? As I looked at her, she gave a little smile, as though at some private joke. I said good night to everybody, and as I left the room, I heard Sir Percival say impatiently to the Count, "Come outside and have a smoke, Fosco." "With pleasure, Percival, when all the ladies have gone to bed," replied the Count. Up in my room, I could not stop myself thinking about this private discussion between Sir Percival and the Count, postponed all day, and now, it seemed, about to take place in the silence and loneliness of the night. After a while, I went from my bedroom into my sitting room and closed the door between the rooms. It was dark, as no candles were lit, and I looked out of the open window for some time, down into the blackness of the garden. There was a smell like rain in the still, heavy air. Suddenly, I saw 2 red points of light advancing in the dark and stopping below my bedroom window, inside which a candle was burning. One red point was small, the other was big. The Count smoking a cigarette, and Sir Percival smoking a cigar, I think. They could not see me in the darkness of my sitting room, so I waited to hear what they said.
"Why don't you come in and sit down?" Sir Percival said.
"Wait till we see that light go out," replied the Count. "When I know she's in bed, and I have checked the rooms on each side of the library, then we will talk." Such secrecy! I decided I must listen to this conversation, in spite of the Count's efforts to keep it private. The idea terrified me, but Laura's happiness, perhaps even her life, might depend on what I heard. How could I do it? I realized I could get out onto the flat veranda roof, which ran past the bedrooms, about 3 feet below the windows. It was narrow, but there was room to move along it till I was above the library window. The Count and Sir Percival usually sat near the open windows smoking, and if they did, I would be able to hear them from above. I went back to my bedroom, put on a long, dark cloak with a hood, and put out the candle. Then, after a while, I returned to my sitting room and climbed out of the window onto the veranda roof. My heart began to beat very fast. I had to pass 5 windows. 4 were dark, but the 5th window was the Countess's room, and it looked out over the exact place above the library where I planned to sit, and there was still a light in it. I crept along the roof, then went down on my hands and knees to pass her window. As I passed, I looked up and saw her shadow against the thin curtains at the window. I stopped breathing. Has she heard me? Will she look out? No. The shadow moves away. She's gone. Now I move to my position at the edge of the roof and begin to listen. Are they there, or have they gone elsewhere for their talk? Ah, I can hear the Count's voice. "Miss Halcombe's light is out. The rooms next door are empty. The only window with a light in is my wife's. So now we may talk. We are at a serious crisis in our affairs, Percival, and we must decide about the future tonight." "It's a worse crisis than you think," growls Sir Percival. "Listen, Percival. This is our situation. We both came to this house in need of money, and the only way of getting it was with the help of your wife. Now, what did I tell you? I told you never to lose your temper with her, and especially never with her sister, Miss Halcombe. And have you remembered this? Not once. Your mad temper lost your wife's signature, lost the ready money, made Miss Halcombe write to the lawyer for the first time." "First time? Has she written again?" "Yes, she has written again today." "What? How does he know that? Did he follow me to the hotel? But even if he did, he couldn't have seen the letters. They went straight from my hand to Fanny's dress. So how does he know?
You're lucky, the Count continues, that you have me in the house to undo the harm that you do. Lucky that I said no when you were mad enough to make your wife a prisoner and keep her from Miss Halcombe. Can't you see that Miss Halcombe has the courage and understanding of a man? How I admire that woman. But she stands like a rock between us and that pretty little wife of yours. Now the money. We have obtained a loan, a horribly expensive loan, by signing a document promising to repay it in 3 months. When the time comes, is there really no way to repay the money, except by the help of your wife? None. What money do you actually get from your wife at present? Only the income from her £20,000. Do you expect any more from your wife? Absolutely nothing, except in the case of her death. Aha, in the case of her death. A pause. It has begun to rain, and already I feel wet and cold. Sir Percival again. If she leaves no children, I get her £20,000. Percival, do you care about your wife? Fosco, that's a very direct question. Let's say your wife dies before the end of the summer. Forget it, Fosco. You would gain £20,000. Speak for yourself as well as for me, Fosco. You would also gain. My wife's death would be £10,000 in your wife's pocket. Percival, here is the position. If your wife lives, you pay that debt with her signature on the document. If your wife dies, you pay the debt with her death. The light in Madame Fosco's room goes out, and the veranda roof is now sunk in darkness. The rain continues. I listen with every nerve in my body, memorizing word after word. Percival, you must now leave this matter in my hands. I have more than 2 months to find the solution, so let's not talk about it any more. Let me help you with your other difficulty, the difficulty that seems to have the name of Anne Catherick. Look, Fosco, we may be friends, but we still have our secrets. This does not concern you. Please don't ask me about it. My friend, I can respect a secret, so I won't ask you to tell me, but can I help you all the same? If I don't find Anne Catherick, I'm a lost man. Both she and her mother know this secret. It could ruin me, Fosco. Anne Catherick has spoken to my wife, and I'm sure she's told her. But as your wife, surely it's in her interest to keep it a secret. If she loved me, that would be true. But she's in love with someone she met before we married, a drawing teacher called Walter Hartright. And who helped Anne Catherick escape from the asylum? Hartright. Who saw her again in Cumberland? Hartright. He knows the secret, and my wife knows the secret. If they get together, they will use it against me. Yes, I see. Where is Mr. Hartright? Out of the country. He sailed for America. Don't worry, then. I will deal with him if he ever comes back. Depend on it. But first, We must find Anne Catterick. What about her mother? Can she be trusted? It's in her interest not to tell anyone the secret. Good. Now, how will I recognize Anne Catterick? Easily. She's the pale, sickly likeness of my wife. A noise as a chair is pushed back. The Count has jumped to his feet and is walking about. He seems amazed. What? Are she and your wife related to each other? Not at all. And yet so alike? Well, I will know her when I see her. What the devil are you laughing about, Fosco? Just a thought, my good friend. Just a thought. But enough for tonight. You will pay the debt and find Anne Catterick. I promise you. You can put your mind at rest, Percival. Not another word is spoken. I hear the library door close. I am wet to the skin, stiff and aching with the cold. At first I can't move, but slowly, painfully, I creep back to my window and climb in. As I fall on the floor, I hear the clock strike 1:15. Time passes. Somehow I manage to get up and put on dry clothes. I am burning hot and shivering with cold. I know I must write down what I have heard, so I find paper and pen and write without stopping. The fever rises in me, burning, burning. I open the window for cool air. 8:00. Bright sunshine which hammers at my eyes. My head aches, my bones ache, my skin burns, yet I cannot stop shivering. I lie down to sleep, my writing finished, and in my fever I see Count Fosco come into my room and read the pages I have written. He smiles. I am helpless, unable to move, speak, breathe, and I sink into the long, black night of illness. Chapter 8. Fever. While I lay unconscious in my illness, I knew nothing, of course, of the events happening around me. It was only much later that I learnt from other people what had happened. When I eventually returned to Limmeridge, Fanny told me about the letters and the night she had left Blackwater. "You left me at about 7, miss, and at 9:00 I had another visitor. The Countess. Yes, I was so surprised, but she was very kind. She saw that I was upset at leaving and insisted on having some tea with me. So I drank my tea, and 5 minutes later I fainted, for the first time in my life. When I woke up, it was about half an hour later. A lady from the hotel was looking after me, as the Countess had to go home. I checked the letters in my dress, miss, and they were both there, quite safe. And just as you told me in London, I posted the letter to Mr. Kyrrell, and as soon as I got to Limmeridge, I delivered the other letter personally to Mr. Fairley. I told him all about being dismissed by Sir Percival and everything, and what had happened at the hotel, but, well, he didn't seem very interested, miss." That last piece of information did not surprise me in the least. Had Laura's uncle ever been interested in anybody except himself? When I went to talk to him, he was full of excuses. "My nerves, dear Marion. Remember my nerves. Yes, of course I will tell you about the letters, but please don't get excited and go around banging doors. Try to stay calm." "I suppose my letter about Laura upset you," I said. "Of course it did, dear Marion. What was I to do? You told me Laura needed to escape from her husband and to come to Limerick. But suppose Sir Percival had come after her. Think of the noise, the arguments, the banging of doors. That's why I wrote to you, to beg you to come here first by yourself, to talk the matter over with me. I never saw that letter, of course, as it arrived at Blackwater when I was unconscious with fever. And Mr. Kyrrell wrote to you as well, didn't he? I said. Yes. He wrote to say he had received an envelope addressed to him in your handwriting, but which contained only a plain piece of paper without a word on it. He had written to you about it and had received no reply. Why he expected me to explain this mystery, I had no idea, and that's what I told him. So helpful, I thought bitterly. But there was no point in saying anything. And were you surprised not to hear from me again? Indeed I was, until my sister's foreign husband, that extraordinary Count Fosco, came to see me. Such a huge man, said Mr. Fairley, his eyes closing at the memory, but surprisingly quiet on his feet. Anyway, he explained how ill you were, dear Marion, which is why you hadn't replied to my letter. I was extremely shocked and sorry to hear about your illness, but the Count did talk so much. I thought he would never leave. And he persuaded you to write to Laura, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and quiet. Yes, he urged me, in fact practically ordered me, to invite Laura here at once. She was too nervous and upset to be of any use to you in the sick room, he said, and the situation with Sir Percival was growing more dangerous every day. There was no trouble with the journey because he and his wife had just rented a house in London, so Laura could travel up to London, stay the night with them, and travel on to Cumberland the next day. So you wrote the letter and gave it to him, I said. Where was the harm in it? In any case, I never for a moment thought that Laura would leave you alone when you were so ill. And how was I to know what shocking event was about to take place? No one could possibly say that I was to blame. I know now exactly who was to blame, but it took quite a time to put all the different pieces of information together. When I first began to be aware of my surroundings again during my recovery, I knew nothing, of course, about the letters. I knew only that I was not in my usual bedroom, and there was a foreign lady looking after me. I had no idea who she was, and she would not answer any of my questions. So I was very relieved a few days later when the familiar face of Mrs. Mitchelson appeared. "Oh, Mrs. Mitchelson," I said, "I'm so glad to see you. Please tell me what's been happening." You've had typhus fever, Miss Halcombe. You've been very ill, but you're getting stronger now, I'm happy to say.
Typhus? No wonder I feel so weak. And my sister, Lady Glyde, I do hope she didn't catch the infection.
No, she didn't.
Mrs. Mitchelson would not look me in the face, and I began to feel worried. Was she afraid to tell me something? Is my sister ill? Please, Mrs. Mitchelson, I must know.
No, she's not ill, but she's not here. She went away yesterday to London and is going on to Limerick today.
I stared at her. Laura gone? I could not believe it. What did it mean? Had something terrible happened? I remembered the conversation I heard during the night on the veranda roof, and my heart filled with fear. And Sir Percival? I could not finish my question.
Sir Percival left the house last night to go abroad, she said. The Count and Countess have gone to London, and the servants have all been dismissed, except for a cook and the gardener. You and I are the only people living in the house, Miss Halcombe."
The shock of this news was so great that I felt faint. Mrs. Mitchelson hurried to fetch me a glass of water.
"Oh, Miss Halcombe, I'm sorry," she said.
"Try not to worry. You must rest now and try to sleep a little." Later, when I felt stronger, we talked again. "Tell me everything you can remember from the day I fell ill," I begged Mrs. Mitchelson. "I must know what happened."
"Well, Miss Halcombe, on that first morning, a servant found you, lying on your bed in a fever, holding a pen tightly in your hand. The doctor was called at once, a Mr. Dawson, who said you were very ill. The Countess and I acted as your nurses. Lady Glyde wanted to help, but she was so upset at seeing you unconscious that she couldn't stop crying. Sir Percival and the Count were concerned about you too, though they seemed worried about something else as well. In fact, the Count spent 3 days down by the lake at that old boathouse, and I remember he came in once when I was going through the hall. Sir Percival came rushing out of the library saying, 'Have you found her?' I didn't hear the answer, and I have no idea who they were talking about."
I had a very good idea who they were talking about, but it was obvious that Mrs. Mitchelson didn't, so I said nothing.
"Your fever got worse," Mrs. Mitchelson went on. "The Count said we needed a nurse to help us, so Madame Fosco took the train to London and came back with Mrs. Rubel."
"Is that the foreign lady who was looking after me before you appeared, Mrs. Mitchelson?" I asked.
"Yes, that's right. She didn't say very much, but she was a capable nurse. I had no complaints about her work. Mr. Dawson, the doctor, was suspicious of her because she was recommended by the Count, and he didn't like the Count at all."
"Why was that?" I asked.
"The Count had a lot of medical knowledge, you see, and he was always suggesting to Mr. Dawson ways of reducing your fever. Mr. Dawson called it interference and got quite angry about it. But in fact, miss, the Count recognised you had typhus fever before Mr. Dawson did. He, the Count that is, went away to London for a week, and when he came back, he took one look at you and said typhus. Mr. Dawson sent to London for another doctor, who came and said the same thing. Then we had a very worrying 10 days when your life was in danger. But at last, the doctor said you were through the worst, and with good nursing care, you would recover. Lady Glyde was so overcome by this happy news that she became ill herself and had to be put to bed."
"My sister has always had delicate health," I said.
"Yes, she's not strong. Anyway, Miss Halcombe, it was at this point that disturbing things started to happen. First, the Count and Mr. Dawson argued again so fiercely that Mr. Dawson left, saying he refused to offer his services any more. Next, Sir Percival told me that he was going to close the house. As soon as you and Lady Glyde were able to travel, he said, you'll be going away for a change of air. He told me to dismiss all the servants, except a girl to do the cooking, and a gardener. Imagine, just like that. I tell you, Miss Halcombe, if I hadn't felt so sorry for you and Lady Glyde, I would have resigned at once."
"The last thing was very strange indeed," said Mrs. Mitchelson, shaking her head.
"Sir Percival said that you and Lady Glyde would benefit from a stay at the seaside town of Torquay. He told me to go there to look for a suitable house to rent, and told me how much money I could pay. Well, I knew it wasn't enough, and I wish now that I hadn't gone. But he was my employer, so I thought I had to obey his orders. I returned yesterday, after 2 days away and told Sir Percival that it was impossible to find a house at such a low rent. Sir Percival showed no interest in my news at all. He just said that the Count and Countess had left Blackwater Park for their new house in London. Mrs. Mitchelson looked at me anxiously. "I think you'll find the next part of the story very upsetting," she said. "Poor Lady Glyde was cruelly deceived by her husband." "You don't surprise me," I murmured. "Please go on." "After seeing Sir Percival, I went upstairs to see you and Lady Glyde. Your sister, though still very weak, was feeling better and wanted to get up and go and visit you in your room. I helped her to dress, and as we went down the passage, we met Sir Percival. 'If you're going to see your sister, you won't find her,' Sir Percival says. 'She left the house yesterday with Fosco and his wife. She decided to go with them to London, on her way to Limmeridge. Mrs. Rebel went too, to look after her on the journey. You can look in her room if you don't believe me.' I was shocked and amazed by this, and Lady Glyde's face went as white as a sheet. She almost ran down the passage and threw open the door to your room. It was empty. Then she cries out to Sir Percival. Marian was much too ill to travel. Even if she did go, she would never leave without saying goodbye to me first. And why would she go to Limmeridge alone, leaving me here at Blackwater Park?" "Because your uncle won't receive you till he has seen your sister first," says Sir Percival. "Have you forgotten the letter he wrote to her at the beginning of her illness?" All through this interview, Miss Halcombe, I thought Sir Percival seemed very strange, jumpy and nervous, not at all his usual self. And now he just turned and walked away. Lady Glyde was shaking with fear and looked at me with terror in her eyes. "Something's happened to my sister. I must follow her. I must see that she's alive and well with my own eyes. Please, Mrs. Mitchelson, come down with me to Sir Percival. Stay with me, please." She held my arm so tightly that I had to go with her. Sir Percival was in the dining room, drinking. He drank at least 4 glasses of wine while we were in there, Miss Halcombe. Lady Glyde was very brave, I thought. She said, "If my sister is well enough to travel, then so am I. Please allow me to follow her at once by the afternoon train." Sir Percival was so rude and rough with her. "You can go tomorrow," he said. "I'll write to Fosco. He can meet you at the station, and you'll stay at his house overnight." Lady Glyde's hand began to tremble violently on my arm. "I would rather not stay at the Count's house," she said. Sir Percival then got very angry. "Why not?" he shouted. "What's wrong with sleeping at your aunt's house? Your sister slept there last night to break her journey, and so will you. That's what your uncle, Mr. Fairley, wants you to do as well. Here, there's a letter from him. I forgot to send it up to you." Poor Lady Glyde was shaking so much that she gave me the letter to read to her. It was very short. I remember it word for word. "Dear Laura, please come whenever you like. Break the journey by sleeping at your aunt's house. Sorry to hear of Marian's illness. Your fond uncle, Frederick Fairley." Lady Glyde didn't try to argue any more, and we went back upstairs. It seemed quite a sensible plan to me, Miss Halcombe, and I couldn't understand why Lady Glyde was so terrified of Count Fosco. She walked up and down her room, whispering, "Poor Marian, in that horrible man's power. I must find her, even if I have to follow her to Count Fosco's house." The next day, I helped Lady Glyde get ready and went with her to the station. If Marion has already left for Limmeridge, I won't stay at the Count's house, she told me. I'll go and stay with Mrs. Vesey, my old governess. As the train pulled away, I saw her pale, frightened face at the window. I felt so sad for her. Then I came back here. Imagine my surprise, Miss Halcombe, when I saw Mrs. Rubell walking in the garden. "What are you doing here?" I said. "You went to London with the Foscos and Miss Halcombe." And then it all came out. You were still in the house. While I was out of the way in Torquay, they moved you to a room in an unused part of the house and kept you hidden. You must have been in a very deep sleep when they moved you. Perhaps they drugged you, I don't know. Then Sir Percival appeared and gave me this explanation. It was all for his wife's own good, he said. She needed a change of air and would not have gone to Limmeridge if she had known that you were still in the house. He spoke in such a violent, angry way that I did not dare to express my opinion. So, you see, Miss Halcombe, that was how poor Lady Glyde was deceived. It was wicked and cruel. I would have resigned my position immediately, but Sir Percival told me that Mrs. Rubell was leaving, and there would be no one to look after you if I left too. So naturally I stayed. Sir Percival left last night, as I told you. The gardener said he seemed half mad. He called for his carriage and drove away like an escaped criminal, saying his house was a prison and he would never return to it. I hope and pray, Miss Halcombe, that I never see that man again. Poor Laura, how she must have suffered. There was nothing I could do. I could not go after her, as I was too weak even to stand. I hoped desperately that she had found out about the deception and would write soon to tell me that she was safe. A letter came a few days later, but it was not for me, and not from Laura. It was for Mrs. Mitchelson, from Madame Fosco. Mrs. Mitchelson came into my room with the letter in her hand. Mr. Dawson, who had agreed to be my doctor again now that the Count had gone, was behind her. I took one look at both their faces and sat up in bed, terrified. What is it?" I gasped. You have some dreadful news for me. I can see it in your faces." Mrs. Mitchelson sat down on the edge of the bed and took my hand. "Your poor, dear sister, Lady Glyde," she began. The room began to darken around me, as though night was falling, and the words seemed to come from a great distance, "was taken seriously ill when she arrived at her aunt's house in London, and died the next day very suddenly. She is to be buried at Limmeridge, in her mother's grave." Kind Mrs. Mitchelson nursed me through my second illness with Mr. Dawson's help. I was not able to travel for more than 3 weeks, but eventually I found the strength to leave that hated house and return to Limmeridge. Mrs. Mitchelson and I travelled together to London, where I went to see Mr. Kyrrell. To him I revealed the terrible suspicions in my mind about the circumstances of my sister's death. He was most concerned and promised to make inquiries for me. I went on to Limmeridge House, and a few days later Mr. Kyrrell wrote to me there. He had taken statements from several witnesses, he said, and was convinced that nothing suspicious had happened. He sent copies of the statements for my information. This was the one by the Count's cook, Mrs. Hester Pinhorn. "I was recently employed as a cook by the Count and Countess Fosco at 5 Forest Road, St. John's Wood. One day, near the end of July, the Countess's niece, Lady Glyde, arrived at the house. She immediately fell ill. I saw her lying on the sofa, her face all white. I ran out for a doctor and came back with Mr. Goodrick. He examined her and said she had a very serious heart disease. During the night she got worse. Then, at about 5 o'clock the next day, she lost consciousness. The doctor went in and, after putting his hand on her heart, announced that she was dead. He said that, as the Count was a foreigner, he himself would go to record the death at the district office. The Count and Countess were very badly affected by the lady's death. The lady's husband was abroad, so they arranged the funeral themselves, which took place in Cumberland. I was still very weak from my long illness, and despair nearly overtook me at this point. I had no friend to turn to, and no idea what to do next. I went every day to the churchyard to put flowers on the grave, and to read again those sad, sad words. In loving memory of Laura, Lady Glyde, wife of Sir Percival Glyde, of Blackwater Park, Hampshire, born the 27th of March, 1829, died the 25th of July, 1850.